Tonight, we wander slowly through the cobbled streets of medieval Europe, where some people managed to turn the art of doing almost nothing into an actual profession. The night opens softly, with a low hush of wind brushing across cobblestones, carrying the faint scent of damp hay and wood smoke. You walk slowly, as though your steps aren't entirely yours to rush, past crooked cottages that lean into each other like tired neighbors whispering secrets. Lanterns hang unevenly, glowing like small pockets of melted gold in the fog. Somewhere, a dog barks lazily at nothing in particular, then decides it isn't worth the effort and quiets again. Welcome to medieval Europe. You probably won't make it through this day awake. Before we go further, a gentle word: if you enjoy wandering through history at this glacial pace, you can like and subscribe to this channel. It's free, painless, and like most medieval jobs we'll be talking about tonight, utterly optional. And if you feel inclined, leave a comment with your location and the time where you are. Imagine us all scattered across the world, a quiet village stitched together by lantern light and sleepy internet signals. Now let's ease into tonight's journey. You begin with a profession so pointless that even peasants probably snickered at it: the groom of the stool. Yes, that's right, it's exactly what you think. In royal courts, there existed a man whose entire duty revolved around the monarch's most private business. He was trusted with chamber pots, wipes of fine linen, and, most importantly, absolute discretion. Imagine waking up each morning knowing your career goal is, quite literally, to sit in a bathroom and nod politely. It's the kind of resume line you leave off LinkedIn. Yet, paradoxically, this role carried influence. The groom of the stool had direct, intimate access to the king, often hearing his grumbles, secrets, or half-formed ideas. Some even shaped royal policies because, well, when someone is mid-daily business, they're surprisingly honest. You pass a narrow alley where a washerwoman wrings out laundry into a bucket. She glances at you as if to say, "At least my job involves soap." Her hands are red from the icy water. You almost feel sorry for her, but then remember, at least she can take pride in clean linen, not linen of an entirely different nature. Here's the odd tidbit. The linen cloths used by grooms of the stool were sometimes perfumed, a luxury in an era when most people thought bathing twice a year was excessive. Scholars still debate whether these perfumed linens were a sign of dignity or a desperate attempt to make the job less unbearable. A horse cart clatters past, the driver half asleep, the donkey plodding as if it knows the way by memory alone. You take a deep breath. This village feels both alive and drowsy, like a candle burning down to its wick. Somewhere a bell tolls, not for an urgent announcement, just because bells like to remind people they existed. You keep walking, the thought lingering. In this world, even the most absurd duties could hold weight. And as ridiculous as it seems, the man with the stool brush had a seat closer to power than most lords. You smile faintly. History has a sense of humor, even if it doesn't know it. Morning creeps slowly over the village rooftops, and with it comes another profession so unnecessary that you almost admire the creativity of inventing it: the knocker-upper. Picture this. Instead of alarm clocks, you'd pay someone to walk down your street at dawn and tap your window with a long stick until you groaned awake. Imagine being stuck with that job, creeping around before sunrise, poking sticks at shutters while people mutter at you from underwool blankets. You see one now, a thin man in patched breeches, yawning louder than the rooster down the lane, carries a pole taller than himself. He stops at a cottage, raps gently on the window, then waits until a groggy face appears behind the glass. He nods, satisfied, and shuffles on. You wonder how many times he's secretly thought, I could have just stayed asleep too. The irony, of course, is that the knocker-upper had to be the only person in town who didn't need waking up. He was the alarm clock for the alarm clockless. And yes, sometimes even he needed a knocker-upper of his own, a smaller child or spouse tasked with the noble duty of prodding him awake first. Historically, this profession lasted much longer than you'd think, clinging stubbornly into the 19th century. Entire communities depended on this one yawning soul with a stick. Factory workers in early industrial towns often relied on knocker-uppers to make it to their shifts. This meant your livelihood could rest on whether one man decided not to hit snooze on his own life. An odd cultural detail surfaces here. Some knocker-uppers used pea shooters instead of sticks, firing dried peas at bedroom windows to wake their clients. Picture medieval sleep interrupted not by a cheerful alarm chime, but by the gentle plink of a pea bouncing off glass. Not exactly the majestic call to arms of a new day. Historians still debate whether this was more efficient or just more annoying. You wander past a row of crooked cottages, the smell of porridge wafting out of one. A dog stretches, a baker yawns, and the knocker-upper raps another window with his long stick, receiving a wave from a sleepy child. Everyone accepts it. After all, absurdity only becomes absurd when you stop to think about it. And you keep walking, realizing. Life here was held together by the flimsiest of jobs, strange duties that somehow mattered in their own tiny ways. You almost envy the simplicity, wake people up and you're done. Go home, nap until the next morning, repeat. A thought flickers across your mind. Maybe the modern world isn't so different. After all, some people still make a living reminding others of things they already knew. Notifications, reminders, nudges, it's all a digital knocker-upper, dressed in new clothes. You smile faintly, the fog still curling in the streets, as the day begins with a rhythm that's both pointless and oddly comforting. The sun, faint and indecisive, climbs slowly through a pale sky as you make your way past a muddy market square. The stalls are just waking up, wooden shutters creaking open, sellers yawning into their own hands. Somewhere, a man coughs like an old engine that won't quite start. This is where you meet the next profession, the gong farmer. You don't need to brace yourself. Don't worry, I'll spare you the unpleasant bits. Let's just say these were the men whose job was to clear out the cesspits of towns and castles. Yes, someone actually volunteered for that. Or maybe not volunteered, maybe ended up here because all other jobs were taken. You walk past him now. A hunched man, rope around his waist, boots caked with more history than you want to imagine. He shuffles down an alley with the look of a man who has learned to breathe through his mouth. And here's the strangest twist of all. Gong farmers were surprisingly well paid. While other peasants scraped together pennies, this fellow might earn a decent wage just for handling what everyone else preferred to ignore. It's like being the trash collector of the Middle Ages, thankless, mocked, but strangely essential. You catch a curious cultural detail. In some towns, gong farmers were only allowed to work at night, when their labors wouldn't offend polite company. This meant they were creatures of shadows, moving through dark lanes, hauling buckets in silence while everyone else pretended nothing was happening. Imagine the medieval version of a night shift, with even less glamour. Historians still debate whether the stigma attached to gong farmers was permanent, or if their higher wages eventually earned them a grudging respect. Probably not. People are funny about these things. They'll happily accept the service while never inviting you to dinner. A horse flicks its tail nearby, unimpressed. A child points at the gong farmer and giggles, not understanding the weight of the man's work. You keep walking, thinking. The line between dignity and ridicule is often thinner than a cobweb. And here's the first of your 3 dry jokes for this section. If you think your job stinks, remember, at least you're not legally bound to prove it. You leave the market behind, passing a row of crooked houses where the smell of cabbage cooking seeps from the windows. The world here doesn't rush. It yawns, stretches, scratches itself, and carries on. And you, drifting through, start to see how entire societies survived on jobs nobody really wanted but everyone needed. And yet, when you think of it, you realize half of modern corporate meetings still feel like gong farming, just with more paperwork. Later in the day, you find yourself walking along the castle's outer walls, where the air smells of wet stone and wood smoke. Pigeons scatter as you pass, flapping upward in a confused gray cloud. You pause near a gatehouse, where a man in absurdly tall boots sits on a stool, looking dramatically bored. This, dear traveler, is the official ale taster. Yes, someone was paid to drink for a living. But before you get excited, let's be clear. His job was less medieval wine tour and more professional guinea pig. You watch him dip a ladle into a barrel, slurp noisily, and smack his lips with an exaggerated nod. Somewhere, a brewer waits nervously, hoping the batch isn't poisoned or spoiled. If the taster survives, the ale is considered safe. That's it. That's the job. One historical fact worth savoring. Ale was the daily drink for nearly everyone, even children. Water wasn't always reliable, and a weak ale was often safer. This meant professional tasters weren't just luxuries. They were minor safeguards against very bad mornings. And yet the absurdity remains. Imagine going to bed at night knowing tomorrow you'll wake up, drink other people's mistakes, and either survive or not. Here's your obscure cultural tidbit. Some ale tasters wore special leather badges, tokens of authority to prove they weren't just freeloaders sneaking sips from taverns. Because, of course, in a world where jobs were invented from thin air, someone had to check whether the checker was legit. Historians still debate whether ale tasters were genuinely effective, or if they simply built a nice career out of performing a very dramatic gulp and shrug. You lean against the cold stone wall, watching the man tip back another cup with all the seriousness of a knight preparing for battle. Then he burps softly and waves at a boy to roll the barrel along. You chuckle because the absurdity is too tempting. Here is a man who invented quality control centuries before corporate logos, yet all he gets is indigestion. As you turn away, the castle looms in the background, shadow falling across the fields. You notice a farmer trudging by with a cart of turnips, looking at the ale taster with thinly veiled envy. After all, one man spends all day in mud, the other in mugs. Which is the better fate? That, perhaps, depends on how much you like turnips. Your steps slow, the afternoon light lengthens, and the world seems both ridiculous and reassuring. No matter how strange the role, someone always filled it. And somehow society kept stumbling forward, one pointless sip at a time. The road curves away from the castle walls, leading you toward the open meadow just beyond the village. Sheep graze lazily, looking like soft clouds stitched to the earth. A shepherd whistles idly, though the animals barely listen. They've heard it all before. And here you come across one of the strangest professions in the medieval lineup, the knocker-upper. No, not what it sounds like. This was a job in which someone was paid to wake people up in the morning by knocking on their doors or windows. Yes, before alarm clocks, someone had to be the alarm. You watch a wiry man wander the lane with a long stick, tapping rhythmically at shutters. Tap, tap, tap. Time to wake, you lazy medieval bones. Some families even paid extra for him to come back a second time, in case they hit the medieval version of a snooze button. Your historical fact here is that this profession lingered shockingly long, well into the 19th century in parts of Europe. So if you thought this was only a medieval quirk, think again. Humanity clung to this system far longer than seems reasonable. For a strange cultural tidbit, some knockers-up, particularly in northern England centuries later, used pea shooters to rattle windows with a spitball. Yes, people literally paid others to spit peas at their house at dawn. History doesn't always glow with dignity. Historians still debate whether knockers-up were truly reliable, or if they sometimes forgot to visit less generous clients. After all, nothing says power quite like holding the keys to someone's morning routine. You smile as you imagine modern equivalents, perhaps paying someone to jiggle your mouse at work so your computer doesn't go idle. Or worse, someone pacing outside your flat at sunrise with an air horn. Some jobs die out for very good reasons. A rooster crows nearby, unimpressed at the competition. The knocker-upper scowls at it, muttering under his breath. There's nothing like losing market share to poultry. Your dry joke number 1. The knocker-upper proves that being annoying can, in fact, be monetized. Dry joke number 2. If you were bad at your job, at least your clients would sleep through the failure. And dry joke number 3. Imagine introducing yourself at a medieval dinner party. So, what do you do? Oh, I specialize in making other people grumpy before sunrise. You walk on, amused, while the tapping fades into the distance. The meadow wind smells of grass and wood smoke. The day stretches gently, as if even time itself has nowhere urgent to be. By late afternoon, the village feels warmer, more alive. The bakery exhales the smell of bread, and a couple of chickens dash clumsily across your path. You hear a lute strumming somewhere, though out of tune, like a cat wrestling with string. And here you stumble upon another forgotten occupation, the sin eater. This was a person hired to eat bread or a meal over a corpse, symbolically taking on the sins of the deceased, so their soul might pass more easily into the afterlife. You pause, struck by the strangeness of it. A man chewing stale crusts beside the dead, as neighbors whispered prayers. The sin-eater sits in the corner of a dim cottage now, gnawing quietly, while the family looks on. His eyes don't meet theirs. He isn't welcome at their table when the food is fresh, only here when it tastes of sorrow and obligation. Your historical fact. Sin-eating was more common in rural parts of Britain and Wales, surviving in pockets into the 19th century. Though condemned by the church, it persisted because families wanted reassurance, no matter how superstitious or awkward the ritual. For your obscure tidbit, some traditions insisted that the sin-eater must also drink a special ale, brewed for the ceremony. Imagine a job that combines grief counseling, catering, and awkward silence into one deeply unpopular package. Historians still debate whether sin-eaters genuinely believed they carried sins away, or whether they simply accepted the coins with a shrug and a dry throat. Faith, desperation, and a little theater. Lines blur easily in village life. You stand quietly as the man wipes his mouth, finishes the ritual, and slips out into the twilight without thanks. His footsteps echo down the lane like someone who knows they will never truly belong. Your jokes arrive quietly, like nervous coughs at a funeral. Imagine explaining this career to your parents. Yes, I'm a professional sinner. Don't worry, it's freelance. The job perks were terrible. No health benefits, no friends, but at least free bread. And if you really hated your neighbor, you might hire a sin-eater just to keep him busy forever. You exhale slowly as the shadows lengthen. The day is slipping toward evening, and with it comes a slower rhythm. You notice the flicker of lanterns being lit in cottages, one by one, like fireflies choosing where to rest. And in the soft hush of this moment, you realize how many of these medieval professions thrived in the narrow gap between need and nonsense. Society wanted comfort, wanted reassurance, wanted excuses, and there was always someone ready to provide it, often for bread, coin, or both. The lane grows quiet now, and you walk on, the rhythm of your steps keeping pace with the sleepy pulse of the village itself. Night creeps gently across the thatched roofs. The air cools, torches flicker along the lanes, and somewhere a dog gives a half-hearted bark before curling back into its dreams. You slow your pace because this is the hour when one of the strangest jobs of all comes alive. The night soil collector. Now, if you're already wrinkling your nose, you're correct. This was the poor soul tasked with emptying chamber pots and privies under cover of darkness, hauling waste away from homes and streets. It was filthy, thankless, and absolutely necessary. Yet, strangely enough, some collectors could make a decent living. Your historical fact: in some cities, night soil was sold to farmers as fertilizer. Yes, human waste made its way from chamber pot to cabbage patch. Recycling isn't new, it just used to smell worse. And the obscure tidbit: certain collectors had territorial disputes, fiercely guarding their waste routes as though they were merchants of gold. Imagine rival gangs meeting in the night, armed not with swords but with buckets. Historians still debate whether collectors were tolerated as public servants or despised as walking symbols of filth. Likely both. Nobody wanted to shake their hand, but everyone wanted them to show up. You follow a man shuffling under the weight of sloshing barrels, his lantern swinging with each step. His face looks resigned, like someone who knows he will never inspire ballads. Yet, without him, the town would drown in its own mess. Dry joke 1. This was the original dirty job. Mike Rowe, eat your heart out. Dry joke 2. They were the unsung heroes of medieval agriculture, though probably best not to sing too close. Dry joke 3. If you've ever complained about taking the trash out, history is here to laugh softly at you. The night soil collector disappears down a slope toward the fields, humming tunelessly, while you turn your eyes upward. Stars pierce through the velvet sky. The air, fresher once he's gone, fills your lungs like a gift. And for a moment you understand, in the medieval world, even the most unpleasant tasks could weave into the rhythm of survival. The moonlight washes the cobblestones silver. Most villagers are asleep now, tucked under woolen blankets, yet you stumble upon another peculiar occupation: the watchman who doesn't really watch. Armed with a lantern and a staff, the town watch was supposed to guard the streets. But in truth, many spent the night leaning on door frames, humming songs, or occasionally shouting the hour to prove they were awake. Your historical fact. In London and many medieval towns, watchmen were often older men, unfit for war or heavy labor, essentially semi-retired but still put on the payroll. Protection was less about catching criminals and more about maintaining the illusion of order. For your obscure tidbit, some watchmen were paid partly in ale. Picture a tipsy guardian, stumbling through the streets, declaring boldly, "It's midnight, and all is well," while his lantern tips dangerously sideways. Historians still debate how effective these watchmen really were. Some records suggest they deterred thieves. Others paint them as laughable figures who barely kept themselves awake, let alone the peace. You stand at the corner as one such man shuffles past, whistling off-key, his staff clunking against the stones. He tips his cap at you, then nearly trips over his own feet. If danger lurks, you realize it probably doesn't feel very threatened tonight. Dry joke 1. This was medieval security theater, plenty of show, questionable results. Dry joke 2. Imagine paying taxes so your protection comes in the form of a half-asleep grandpa with a stick. Dry joke 3. It's all quiet tonight, the watchman says proudly, mainly because he snoozed through the robbery. Still, the watchman's lantern glows warmly against the walls, and somehow that feels enough. Even if crime wasn't stopped, at least the darkness felt less lonely. And sometimes, that's all people really wanted. The comfort of someone else's footsteps echoing in the night. You follow the light as it fades, until it vanishes around a bend. The silence returns, heavier now, like a wool cloak wrapping you in stillness. The medieval world was rarely safe, but in its own sleepy, stumbling way, it tried to offer reassurance. The night has settled thick, like ink spilled across parchment. You wander into the quieter edge of the village, where the air smells faintly of hay and smoke, and stumble upon yet another odd role, the gong farmer. If night soil collector sounded unpleasant, the gong farmer is his underground cousin. This was the person tasked with climbing down into cesspits to shovel out the worst of humanity's leftovers. By law, gong farmers usually worked at night, far from watchful eyes and sharper noses. Your historical fact. Cesspits were often emptied once every few years, meaning the unfortunate gong farmer sometimes stood waist-deep or worse, in a backlog of medieval life. You're welcome for that image. The obscure tidbit? In Tudor England, some gong farmers earned surprisingly high wages for their filthy work, enough to live more comfortably than many artisans. A strange economy indeed. You could be richer than a tailor, simply by shoveling what tailors left behind. Historians still debate how gong farmers were socially regarded, reviled as outcasts, or grudgingly respected for doing what no one else dared. Perhaps both. You watch a weary figure lower himself into the pit with a rope, lantern dangling above, his face set in grim determination. Somewhere in the distance, a cow moos sympathetically, as if even animals pity him. Dry joke 1. If you think your Monday meetings are soul-crushing, imagine these night shifts. Dry joke 2. The medieval job market was literally a cesspool. Dry joke 3. Moving up in the world probably wasn't in his job description. And yet, in a strange, sleepy way, there's nobility here. The gong farmer finishes his work, wipes his brow, and hauls the buckets away. You realize that the village, in its own stinking way, couldn't function without him. Survival was often built on the shoulders of people who worked in the shadows, sometimes very smelly shadows indeed. The air grows fresher as you leave that part of town behind. You walk toward the village square, where silence now reigns, broken only by the crackle of a dying fire. And here you meet one of the most pointless professions of all, the town crier's understudy. Now, you've likely heard of town criers, the loud-voiced announcers who proclaimed news, decrees, and gossip to the illiterate masses. But in larger towns, there were occasionally assistants whose main job was to carry the bell, fetch water, and sometimes echo the crier's words like a medieval hype man. Your historical fact: town criers often had legal protection. Interrupting or harming one was considered an offense against the crown, since they were literally the voice of authority. Their assistants, however, enjoyed no such honor. The obscure tidbit: some records mention criers employing echo boys, whose only purpose was to repeat phrases loudly in crowded markets. Basically human megaphones. Not exactly a career with upward mobility. Historians still debate how common these echo boys really were. Were they everyday fixtures in bustling towns, or rare curiosities? The evidence is scattered, like half-heard shouts on a windy day. You watch as the crier raises his bell, booming out the day's proclamation about rising grain prices. Behind him, the understudy pipes up, "Rising grain prices," with slightly less enthusiasm. The crowd looks mildly irritated, as though they could have managed with one announcement instead of two. Dry joke 1. The first case of job redundancy centuries before middle management. Dry joke 2. Imagine your career being the guy who repeats what the loud guy already said. Dry joke 3. If medieval LinkedIn existed, their headline would read, "Currently echoing. Open to other opportunities." Still, as the echoes die across the square, you notice something almost endearing. The understudy beams with pride, even if no one else cares. For him, this role is a step into the public eye, a tiny slice of importance. And in a world where most voices went unheard, even an echo could matter. The fire hisses, the bell fades, and the square sinks back into silence. You press onward, footsteps slow, as though you too are repeating the rhythm of a day that never quite changes. The path turns toward the edge of town, where the wind smells faintly of damp earth and wood smoke. Here, among huts leaning like tired men, you come across a profession that's both laughable and strangely symbolic: the royal foot wiper. Yes, it was exactly what it sounds like. Certain courts employed servants whose primary job was to kneel and clean the monarch's feet, after walks, baths, or sometimes just because protocol demanded it. A task so narrow it makes even the gong farmer look versatile. Your historical fact: medieval kings and queens often emphasized rituals of cleanliness, not so much for hygiene as for ceremony. To touch royal feet, even for wiping, was considered a sacred act of loyalty. Your obscure tidbit? Some records mention that foot-wiping servants were allowed to keep the used cloths, which, believe it or not, were later sold as relics to the pious. Imagine bidding for a lightly used towel at your local medieval market. Historians still debate how formalized this job really was. Was there an official role, or was it simply one of many humiliations foisted onto low-ranking attendants? The truth likely varies depending on the kingdom and century. You picture a young man, cloth in hand, bowing low before a monarch who barely glances down. The hall is golden and vast, yet his world is small, bounded by ankles and boots. Dry joke 1. Imagine explaining that career path to your parents. Dry joke 2. Moving up in the world literally meant crawling from toe to knee. Dry joke 3. Talk about working your way up from the ground floor. And yet, there's something oddly soothing about the repetition of it. Kneel, wipe, rise, repeat. For the servant, it was a steady rhythm, a tiny anchor in a world of chaos. You walk away, wondering if the job was pointless or simply humbling. The night deepens, stars pricking the sky like tiny pins, and you find yourself near a monastery on the hill. Bells have long since stopped, but within the cloister walls existed a role so peculiar it feels dreamlike. The official sleeper. Yes, certain monasteries assigned a brother to literally fall asleep during services, so that others could watch and make sure no one else dozed. A kind of sacred decoy napper. Your historical fact. Monastic life was built around strict hours of prayer, often waking monks at midnight and again at dawn. Fatigue was inevitable. Having someone safely asleep acted as both warning and permission, a strange way of policing drowsiness. The obscure tidbit? In a few accounts, the designated sleeper was even lightly tapped awake and questioned about his dreams, as dreams were sometimes seen as spiritual messages. Imagine being promoted for snoring insightfully. Historians still debate whether this was a widespread practice or just an oddity of certain abbeys. Some argue it was more symbolic than practical, a reminder of human weakness built into sacred ritual. You imagine the scene. A chapel dim with candlelight, monks chanting softly, and one poor soul slumped against a pillar, head bobbing as the flickering shadows dance across his face. His brothers glance over, and instead of scolding, nod approvingly. His nap is their discipline. Dry joke 1. At last, a career path where falling asleep on the job was required. Dry joke 2. Technically, he was the medieval version of sleep mode. Dry joke 3. HR might have called it dream-based productivity monitoring. And though absurd, the idea carries a strange comfort. In a life of strict devotion, someone was chosen to embody frailty, to nap on behalf of everyone else. You walk away from the monastery walls, yawning yourself, suddenly grateful that some jobs required little more than closing your eyes. Down the market street you wander, past stalls where apples gleam like small suns and butchers close their shutters for the night. But tucked between all this bustle, you find one of the strangest job titles of them all. The Royal Sneeze Catcher. Yes, some courts genuinely appointed attendants whose job was to stand near royalty and quickly present a cloth or handkerchief the instant the monarch looked ready to sneeze. Hygiene aside, this was about dignity, preventing the embarrassment of an undignified sound. Historical fact. Sneezing in medieval Europe was often loaded with superstition. A sneeze could be seen as expelling evil spirits or as a sign of divine favor, depending on context. To manage a king's sneeze was not just practical, but symbolic. Obscure tidbit. Some sneeze catchers even carried perfumed cloths dipped in rosewater, so that the royal nose could be enveloped in fragrance rather than the more natural alternative. Essentially, early medieval Kleenex with an ego. Historians still debate how widespread this job was. Some records mention it in jest, possibly exaggerations. But even exaggerations often echo truths, like the deep obsession courts had with ceremony, no matter how absurd. You picture it. A banquet hall of glittering goblets, roasted peacocks, laughter, and suddenly silence. As the king's nostrils flare, a quick-moving servant appears at his side, cloth ready, as though rescuing the entire kingdom from catastrophe. Dry joke 1. Talk about blowing your career. Dry joke 2. Imagine adding prevented royal sneezes to your medieval resume. Dry joke 3. Probably the only job where bless you counted as a performance review. It's ridiculous, yes, and yet you can't help but think. In a world where so much was uncertain, plagues, wars, famine, maybe controlling a sneeze felt like controlling something, anything, even for a heartbeat. Your steps take you toward the city gate, where guards lean sleepily on spears. Beyond, fields stretch under a pale moon, dotted with cottages and tiny gardens. Here you hear whispers of another job, the official ale taster. Not the cheerful village brewer who proudly samples his own work, but a person appointed solely to taste every batch of ale made for the court, checking not for quality so much as poison. A dangerous career dressed as indulgence. Historical fact. Food and drink poisoning was a real fear in medieval courts, especially among nobility, where rivals often lurked. Appointing tasters was a safety measure, though one with questionable effectiveness. You can imagine the job turnover rate. Obscure tidbit. In some towns, ale tasting was also a civic duty. Local officials hired tasters to ensure taverns weren't watering down their brews or charging too much for poor quality. Imagine being paid to complain about beer. Historians still debate whether ale tasters were truly effective safeguards or largely ceremonial. Poison could take hours to show, by which point the job's usefulness was, shall we say, expired. You picture a taster at a grand feast. Nobles chatting, music playing, and a man at the edge of the table sipping solemnly, waiting. His every burp watched like a scientific experiment. The nobles laugh, the feast resumes, and the poor taster sits there with his fate bubbling in his stomach. Dry joke 1. The first job with free drinks and terrible benefits. Dry joke 2. Technically the medieval equivalent of product testing. Dry joke 3. In modern terms, it was quality assurance with a side of possible death. And yet, there's something oddly comforting about the ritual. Someone somewhere was paid to taste the ale before you did. Even if it didn't always work, the gesture alone gave people the illusion of safety. Sometimes illusions are all people really need to fall asleep at night. The road curves back toward the inner wards of the city, where the stone walls echo with quieter sounds. The drip of rainwater from roofs, the shuffle of tired feet. Here you stumble across another peculiar title, the Gong Farmer. Now, don't let the word gong fool you. This wasn't someone banging a bronze disc at dawn. A gong farmer was the unfortunate soul tasked with clearing out cesspits and privies, often in the dead of night. A job so lowly that laws required them to live apart from the rest of society, sometimes only allowed to work after dark so nobody had to see them. Historical fact. In 16th century London, gong farmers could earn surprisingly good wages, sometimes as much as a skilled craftsman, because naturally nobody else wanted to do the job. Obscure tidbit. They carried long-handled scoops, buckets, and occasionally even wore crude leather suits to protect themselves. But protection only went so far. Many records mention suffocation accidents, when workers climbed too far into pits filled with toxic fumes. It was dangerous, exhausting, and endlessly thankless. Historians still debate just how organized this industry was, whether it was centrally regulated or largely informal, handled by whomever was desperate enough to accept the coin. And yet, imagine it. A midnight figure, lantern swinging, trudging toward a privy with tools clanking. Their labor meant city dwellers could live without drowning in their own waste. It was ugly, yes, but essential. Dry joke 1. You thought your day job stank, this one literally did. Dry joke 2. A career path with no upward mobility, only downward shoveling. Dry joke 3. The only job interview question was, do you have a strong stomach? Oddly enough, while it was humiliating, gong farmers kept the city livable. Without them, medieval towns might have collapsed under their own filth. Sometimes the most pointless jobs turn out to be quietly vital. Later that evening, you cross through a quieter courtyard, its walls pale in the moonlight. Here you meet a stranger who tells you of another medieval job. The Sin Eater. This one sounds more poetic than practical. When someone died, especially in poorer rural areas, a sin eater might be hired to sit beside the body and consume a piece of bread and a cup of ale placed on the chest of the deceased. The idea was that by eating the food, they symbolically absorbed the sins of the departed, letting the soul rest in peace. Historical fact. This practice was most commonly noted in parts of Wales and the English borderlands, lingering well into the early modern era. Though always frowned upon by the church, it persisted in folk tradition. Obscure tidbit. Sin-eaters were often outcasts themselves, shunned for their eerie role yet needed by grieving families who wanted reassurance. They were both despised and relied upon, existing in that shadowy space between religion and superstition. Historians still debate whether sin-eating was truly widespread or more of a localized folk ritual exaggerated by later writers. The records are patchy, and much of the detail comes from travelers' accounts, which aren't always trustworthy. You imagine it. A cottage lit by candlelight, mourners whispering prayers, and a solitary figure hunched over bread and ale, chewing slowly in silence. The air heavy with grief, yet tinged with relief, because if sins could be eaten, then maybe forgiveness was closer at hand. Dry joke 1. Technically the first freelance afterlife consultant. Dry joke 2. Imagine sending an invoice, services rendered, consumed your uncle's regrets. Dry joke 3. Probably the only dinner where nobody else wanted to share your plate. Strange though it sounds, the ritual wasn't about logic. It was about comfort. The living needed to feel that the dead were lighter, that burdens could be passed on, even if only through bread and ale. Comfort, after all, is what most jobs in history truly sell. You pass beneath a stone archway, the echoes of your footsteps swallowed up by the hush of narrow alleys. A fiddler faint tune drifts from a tavern, but the job you stumble upon now belongs less to music and more to misery. The whipping boy. In certain royal courts, when a young prince misbehaved, his tutor could not whip him, because striking a future king was politically unthinkable. So instead, another boy of similar age, raised alongside the prince, would be punished in his place. Historical fact. Whipping boys are recorded most notably in Tudor and Stuart England, though whether they existed in every court is still debated. The theory was that the prince, seeing his friend beaten, would feel guilty and learn proper behavior. Obscure tidbit. Some whipping boys went on to enjoy unusual privileges. Being so close to the prince, They sometimes rose to positions of influence later in life, carrying the scars of childhood friendship with them. Historians still debate whether this was truly widespread or just a handful of cases romanticized later. After all, written records rarely dwell on who got whipped unless it was politically important. You imagine the scene. Two boys sitting in a grand chamber, one sulking after refusing to study Latin, the other bracing as the rod is fetched, and a stern tutor muttering, "You'll learn from this, eventually." Dry joke 1. The first job where taking one for the team was in the actual contract. Dry joke 2. The world's least desirable internship. Dry joke 3. Proof that nepotism sometimes hurts the bystanders more than the boss's kids. It's a strange cruelty, punishing one to educate another. Yet in the logic of hierarchy, even childhood discipline reflected the power of kingship, untouchable while others carried the weight. The road turns rural now, stretching out into quiet fields under starlight. You hear owls calling, a reminder that the countryside has its own odd employments. One of the strangest, the cunning man or cunning woman, a job somewhere between healer, fortune teller, and local problem solver. Historical fact: cunning folk existed across medieval and early modern Europe, practicing folk magic, herbal remedies, and charms. They were often the first people villagers turned to when livestock sickened, milk curdled, or someone suspected witchcraft at work. Obscure tidbit: some specialized in unbewitching services. If you thought your neighbor had cursed you, the cunning man might sell you a charm or perform a ritual involving pins, wax dolls, or even a hare's foot. In other words, part therapy, part superstition, part neighborhood gossip control. Historians still debate whether cunning folk were tolerated because they genuinely helped, or because nobody dared test whether their remedies worked for fear of angering unseen forces. Picture the little cottage. Bundles of dried herbs hanging from beams, a cat winding through the rushes, jars filled with strange powders on the shelves. A worried farmer sits on a stool while the cunning woman mutters incantations over a cracked egg in a bowl of water. Dry joke 1. The original customer support hotline, except you paid in chickens. Dry joke 2. If the cure didn't work, at least the advice was free entertainment. Dry joke 3. Medieval health insurance probably should have just covered visit to local wizard. Sleepy though it sounds, these figures offered more than tricks, they offered hope. In an uncertain world, sometimes reassurance itself was the most valuable commodity of all. The road grows darker now, the moon your only companion, and with it comes another peculiar profession, the gong farmer. Yes, the medieval man, or occasionally unlucky boy, whose job was to shovel human waste out of cesspits. Historical fact: gong farmers were legally required to work only at night, between 9 p.m. and 5 a.m., because the smell was considered intolerable during daylight. Their wages were surprisingly good, sometimes 4 times that of a skilled laborer, but the job left its mark in more ways than one. Obscure tidbit: London's cesspits could grow so full that the waste seeped into nearby wells. Chroniclers note outbreaks of illness, and though no one yet knew the word cholera, they knew something wasn't quite right about drinking water that smelled like a latrine. Historians still debate whether gong farmers were truly despised or quietly respected. After all, someone had to do it, and without them, whole towns would collapse into filth. You picture it. A man with lantern in hand, climbing down a slick wooden ladder into a brick-lined pit, scraping and scooping by torchlight while neighbors bolted their shutters against the stench. Not glamorous, but someone had to keep civilization moving, quite literally, beneath the streets. Dry joke 1. This was the original graveyard shift. Dry joke 2. Job description included free perfume sample, though no one wanted it. Dry joke 3. Sanitation engineer sounds fancy, but it's just Latin for guy with a bucket. Strange as it sounds, the gong farmer's toil kept medieval towns habitable. Sometimes the most thankless professions are also the most necessary. The path winds at last to the edge of the village, where fields stretch into a sleepy horizon. Here, under the faint silver glow of dawn, we meet the last of our odd professions. The knocker-up, yes, the person paid to wake others before alarm clocks existed. Historical fact. Though more common in early modern Europe and even into the Industrial Revolution, the knocker-up's roots stretch back to medieval town criers and watchmen, who also called out the hours. With a long stick, pea shooter, or even stones, they tapped at windows until the groggy workers stirred. Obscure tidbit. Some knocker-ups were so reliable that whole families depended on them for decades, refusing to switch to newfangled alarm clocks. Trust, after all, is its own kind of timekeeping. Historians still debate whether knocker-ups were paid individually by workers or subsidized by employers, but records suggest both systems existed, an early example of how even waking up became commodified labor. Imagine it. You lie in bed, finally warm beneath scratchy blankets, only to hear a tap-tap-tap at the window. A lantern glow, a muttered "up with you, the mill won't wait." And then the figure moves on, disturbing the next household. Dry joke 1. The only job where sleeping on the job was literally impossible. Dry joke 2. The medieval equivalent of snooze button was pretending not to hear. Dry joke 3. LinkedIn probably didn't have a category for professional stick poker. And with that, you've walked the full circle of Europe's strangest, smallest, and often sleepiest professions. Jobs born not out of grandeur but necessity, oddity, or sheer human inventiveness. Now the streets empty, the torches gutter out, and the last bell fades into the hush of morning. You've wandered through alleys and markets, past guild halls and cottages, over bridges and fields, and each step brought you closer not to kings or battles, but to the ordinary people who filled the gaps of history with their peculiar trades. There were men who stared at doorways, boys who bore whippings not their own, women who whispered charms over eggs, farmers who climbed into cesspits, and watchers who tapped on windows. None of them conquered empires, yet each carried a lantern of necessity through the fog of daily life. Close your eyes and you can still feel the uneven cobblestones beneath your feet, hear the creak of shutters in the wind, smell bread cooling on a hearth. These are small details, as quiet as they are enduring, the heartbeat of lives lived in shadows, remembered only because their jobs seemed too odd to forget. Breathe slowly. The night is long, and the past stretches even longer, but both are gentle when walked at this pace. Let the strange humor of medieval Europe settle like mist around you. The reminder that history is not only cathedrals and kings, but porridge, puddles, and professions nobody envied. You probably won't remember every job, and that's all right. What matters is the rhythm, the cadence of a world turning softly, filled with people doing the best they could, often in roles that seem absurd to us now. And so, the lantern dims, the cobbled path ends, and you are left only with stillness. Allow yourself to drift with it, slowly, quietly, as though sleep itself were the final, most necessary medieval profession of all.